Hello there, and welcome to another episode of Three Guys in the Word. My name is Andrew Romer. It's great to be among fellow brothers in Christ. Uh, Chris Miller and Eric Parker. Uh, we're members of the Cheswell Road Church of Christ in Louisville, Kentucky. It's great to be able to continue our study in the Book of Esther. It's been quite exciting these last uh, few episodes where just sometimes we've left off of our discussions on cliffhangers and wanting to know what's going to happen, and um, there's still resolution that is still going to be occurring. Looking forward to what's going to be happening because there's already a lot that is transpired, and um, it's just one of these. Uh, you wouldn't think that necessarily this book would have a lot of action in it potentially, but there's a lot going on, lots of moving parts, and very dramatic. That's why I think I mentioned in several episodes ago, like this would definitely fit like a soap opera in some aspects, but very much looking forward to our discussion. And as always, it's good to be among fellow brothers looking to further delve in and talk more into God's word. But just see how people are doing. Chris, how are things going with you today?
Good. It's been a busy week, but I've enjoyed my Saturday. So and happy that we're able to do this and continue, like you said, Andrew. It kind of is like a soap opera what we've been studying. And if you're like me and you like movies and TV shows, reading the Bible sometimes is a lot more fascinating than we give it credit for. This is not a boring book to read. The Bible is very interesting, very fascinating because we're talking about real people and real situations. So, you watch a movie and sometimes it's fiction. It's not even real. This really happened. And we're blessed that these things are preserved that, thousands of years later, we can sit here and talk about it. So really looking forward to our discussion today, as always. And glad I'm able to do it. How you doing, Eric?
I'm good, man. It's been a good week. Busy week, spending a lot of time in the Garden of Friendship. Uh, find some new flower beds, new friends, and cultivating old friendships. So, very thankful. Got to meet with our little homeschool co-op today. So that's always a privilege. Great getting to know other Christians who desire some of the things that we desire for our family. So very thankful for that. And excited about tomorrow. Gonna be continuing our class on Ezekiel. And Andrew's got the morning sermon, I've got the afternoon sermon. So always an exciting time Saturday building up into Sunday. And I got a chance to speak over in Indiana on Wednesday. So at another congregation. And that was, I think I got invited to that like a year ago. So that was quite a build up as well. Really neat assigned subject to speak on, and I think it went off well. So, looking forward to continuing our discussion. Esther, Andrew, how about you, buddy?
I'm doing okay. It's been a good week. Got to take a couple walks and look at some trees, and kind of made me think of Bob Ross. Sometimes I'll mention Bob Ross in some of my lessons. Just think about trees, or if I come across a body of water or something, just calm, and it's good to be able to get out and do some healthy things. And it's been a fulfilled or full week. Had a one of our members. I had a friend who came on Wednesday night, and hopefully they'll visit again. And they asked for a Bible correspondence course, so Lord willing, they received that, and it's just good that we can make those connections and build relationships with people, especially people that are visiting, and hopefully, Lord willing, will be interested in learning more about what the Bible has to say. So, very much looking forward to, as it's already been mentioned, to tomorrow, and we'll be able to get together. And again, that's just a foretaste of what we look forward into eternity if we are faithful. And before we really look into what chapter 8 has to talk about, we'd like to go around and just briefly share what we saw in our previous video or our previous section that we read. But first, Eric, if you would read our principal verses that guides our discussion.
We've picked Esther 4, 13 and 14. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not imagine that you in the king's palace can escape any more than all the Jews. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this." That's our key text there. And then, of course, last week we talked about chapter 7, went through the first couple of verses of chapter 8. We're really in the heart of the action right now. Telenovela, is what we're dealing with right here. This is a soap opera scene where Esther finally sort of reveals what she wanted to say. It's been this big buildup with Ahasuerus and, multi-day sort of feast thing. And Haman's kind of tugged back and forth by the providence of God to play out, deliverance for the Jews. And he's kind of been all over, and probably Mordecai, although he's not mentioned a whole lot, he gets honored in chapter 6, which is a burr in the saddle of Haman. But Mordecai is probably wondering what's going on too. And finally, in chapter 7, Esther shares what's going on. She says, "Somebody wants to consign me and my peoples to being destroyed. Somebody has committed my people to genocide." And again, it's like this big, like conflict, drawn out to the nth degree. And then, the king's like, "Who is it? Who would do such a thing?" And you've got Esther going, "Haman," like it's just such a perfect soap opera setup. Haman, and of course the king is like, "What am I supposed to do with this? Haman's my top official. He's my top guy, he's my prime minister." And so he has to go clear his head. He goes out in the gardens, right? And he's just kind of clearing his head, like, what am I supposed to do with this? Comes back in, and Haman is pleading with Esther, throwing himself upon Esther. And the king thinks that Haman's trying to assault Esther, and he just blows his lid. He's like, on top of genocide, he's trying to assault the queen in the palace. This is too much. I'll find a prime minister, I'll put a want ad out before, I let this guy go another day in this office. So he's committed to, consigning him to death. And Harbona, apparently, who has been sympathetic to Mordecai and the Jews and Esther, he says, "Oh, by the way, Haman has built this gallows, this just ridiculously tall gallows that's 75 feet tall, that he planned to hang Mordecai on." And so the king says, "Okay, well, the poetic justice is going to play out here. We're going to have Haman hanged from those gallows." And of course, his sons and things are going to be punished, not to reveal too much, but everything that he bragged about basically gets undone over time. And this kind of the way that we left off is at the beginning of chapter 8. The king takes his signet ring for Haman and gives it to Mordecai. So that's kind of a neat reversal. Mordecai should have been honored like a long time ago, because he foiled the plot of rebellion and assassination, the assassination coup, very early on in the book that was referenced, and the one that was read in the historical archives when Ahasuerus could not fall asleep at the beginning of chapter 6. So he ends up finally getting honored. Haman gets what he deserves. Mordecai gets what he deserves. But we're still kind of in limbo about the nation of the Jews, because once a Persian monarch, or a Persian emperor, if you will, wrote up a decree, a legal decree, it was law. And so now we have this law on this day where the Jews are going to be attacked by other people. And what are we supposed to do with this? It's not like we can throw the law out, because that's against Persian policy. So how are we going to fix this? And that's kind of the lingering question and the final resolution for the book. Chris?
It's like we said to start, it is kind of like a movie, a soap opera, the way this plays out, just how everything happens. Like you'd said, Eric, you've got Haman this whole time who is just antagonizing Mordecai, antagonizing the Jewish people. He is the problem throughout this whole book. And Ahasuerus just seems to not realize that he is an issue. And we've talked before, I think I've mentioned this every episode. His judgment is not good. He's not a good judge of character. He's not a good judge of people. He himself is very weak. He's portrayed to be very weak, very manipulative, or very manipulated by others around him. And it takes this interaction with Esther in this banquet, which is the second banquet, that just shows with her how tactful she is. She just doesn't blurt it out. Like, you'd think if your life was in danger and your family's life and your people's life was in danger, you would just run to Ahasuerus and say, you've got to stop this. But Mordecai talks to her from the principal verse that we've read each time. You're in this position for this reason. And she puts a plan in place. And with this plan, she begins to kind of slowly feed information to Ahasuerus, but also kind of keep Haman at bay. It's not one of those where she goes to Ahasuerus behind closed doors and says Haman is doing this. Like Eric said, Haman's in the room when she's like, it's him. He's the one doing this. And what I find so interesting is what we see earlier on in chapter 3. Haman really doesn't identify it's the Jews. It's just like, there's people in your country that are causing problems. They don't follow your laws. You need to do something about these people. And even Esther herself, from what we can tell in the text of what we read, doesn't identify that it's necessarily Jewish people. She just says it's my people. And that's really what it takes for Ahasuerus to kind of wake up. And that's something that we talked about with Haman that's so interesting. Haman particularly has all these opportunities to change, to remove the hate from his heart, to remove his bitterness he feels towards Mordecai and Mordecai's people. But he doesn't do that. It continues to build and build and build. Ahasuerus, on the other hand, changes here a little bit. This enrages him. And like Eric said, whether I think the New King James says he was like slumped over the couch or reclined on the couch, laying over the couch where Esther was. And Ahasuerus just goes 0 to 100 in extent. You could just imagine him kind of pacing outside. What am I going to do? He sees that, and it's like, there is no thinking about what I'm going to do. We need to take care of this. And then you have kind of the poetic justice of the gallows that Haman had prepared for Mordecai. Mordecai's getting what Haman thought he deserved, while Haman ends up getting what he thought Mordecai deserved. So that's a really interesting aspect. But, you think of like a movie, you would think this would be the end of the story. Esther's liberated her people. Mordecai's, like Eric said, given the signet ring. Haman is done away with. But this isn't the end of the story. So that makes this even more of a fascinating book that really, for me reading, you're like, all right, this is the end. We've got the ending that we want. But there's more to this story that we're going to see play out as we continue to study it. What'd you have, Andrew?
Well, the queen is very humble in how she approaches the king, and with the request, she says that, if I found favor in your sight, O king, it's not demanding whatever. And she states it plainly. If it was only a matter of if we were just going to be made slaves, I wouldn't even be bothering you with this trivial matter. So be it. But this is being in regards to extermination. And in verse 6, I kind of wonder if uh, Esther is also implying, hey, he's not ultimately my foe, my people's foe and enemy, because it said earlier specifically Haman, enemy of the Jews. But the way that it's phrased, I wonder if Esther's also pointing like, hey, he's really your enemy too. If you think about it, he's not looking at you for your best interest. And uh, when Esther uh, says that this is my people that are going to be annihilated, I wonder if it finally, I might be giving Xerxes Ahasuerus too much credit here to put two and two together, because he told or mentioned Mordecai the Jew, so Mordecai is a Jew. Would he been able to put the fact that, oh, so you're a Jew as well, and make that connection? I can't say with 100% certainty, but um, as we shared last time, when it's finally okay, it's we've got to the climax, and the villain is finally revealed, unmasked, so to speak, and the king has to decide. Um, in one aspect, you kind of um, you find it, yeah, it's reasonable to or I should say, an example for us not to fly off the handle immediately and just off with their head or whatever, um, but to take a moment to blow off steam or get your composure, um, but then again, I think we talked about this. Okay, how many people were around, and how was Haman able to get to the queen, and what all that looked like? But obviously, it did not look. Um, uh, it very much looked suspicious and questionable as far as what Haman was actually doing. And it is very ironic, and I think I mentioned this last time, that why would Haman uh, go to the queen when uh, his life is in Ahasuerus's hand? Um, he's the one who's going to make the ultimate determination whether he lives or dies. So is this going to harm it, really physically try to kill the queen? Is it something like sexual in nature? I mean, there's definitely questions that as far as what may have happened, just don't necessarily know. But the queen, I mean, the king did not like it. And we know that um, Haman meets his end, and we're now going to pick up and find out, okay, well, there's still something that needs to be settled and addressed. Chris, if you would, why don't you read verses 3 through 8?
Esther 8, verses 3 through 8 says, Now Esther spoke again to the king, fell down at his feet, and implored him with tears to counteract the evil of Haman the Agagite and the schemes which he had devised against the Jews. And the king held out the golden scepter toward Esther. So Esther arose and stood before the king and said, If it pleases the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and the things seem right to the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote to annihilate the Jews who are all in the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see the evil that will come to my people, or how can I endure to see the destruction of my countrymen? Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, indeed, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows because he tried to lay his hands on the Jews. You yourselves write a decree concerning the Jews as you please in the king's name, and seal it with the king's signet ring, for whatever is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet ring, no one can revoke. So it's like Eric had said, you read this story and it's like, all right, Haman's out of the way. Like Andrew said, the villain's been revealed. We've done away with him. There's no more to the story. But like Eric had said with the Persian kings, the decree's still there. This has gone into law at this point. So it's not just like, oh, we got rid of Haman. Great. No, it's still there. And this is still going to be a problem. And you really see Esther here, which is something that I think for her, a word that keeps coming up to me when we read this is vulnerability. There's a lot of vulnerability here with her. She's kind of been reserved. We talked about how in some ways with Mordecai giving her information, she seems kind of out of the loop, like she didn't know what was going on. Well, here she falls to Ahasuerus's feet, with the whole posture thing. It's like, Ahasuerus is standing and she is down. It kind of makes me think of that visual that we're given with the tax collector and the Pharisee standing up looking towards heaven. Esther, like Andrew had pointed out with humility, is I could just see her kind of face down on the ground just begging, please change. And the New King James even says counteract the evil of Haman. So make right the evil that he's done. Do the right thing. And you think of the king extending out that golden scepter. She arises and then she makes the request. If it pleases you, if I found favor in your sight, and this thing seems right to the king, and I'm pleasing, let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman. So it's like, if you think this is the right thing to do, please do it. Now, in one instance, you appreciate the humility there, but Ahasuerus has not had great judgment throughout a lot of this text. So she's kind of giving him, if this seems right to you, please do it. Yeah, it's kind of really a gutsy thing to say because she would probably know that his judgment isn't the best. But I believe she's caught him at a good time considering how infuriated he was with Haman and what Haman had done. But man, verse 6 is really powerful here. With Haman, she talks about he wrote to annihilate the Jews who are in all the king's province. And then she makes it even more personal. How can I endure to see the evil that will come to my people? Or how can I endure to see the destruction of my countrymen? So I think Ahasuerus at this point, you can tell he does care deeply about Esther. He's given her, up to half of his kingdom if that's the request that she made. She's probably safe from this law. I would say he would protect her as the queen. But protection just for her wasn't good enough. She was worried about her countrymen, the fellow Jews outside the palace walls. And she realizes that God has put her, I believe, in this position to be that voice for those people. I cannot bear the thought of my countrymen being annihilated by this law. And I am begging you to do something about this. And it's amazing, 7 through 9 or 7 through 8 that we had just read as well. And I'll pass it on to you, Eric. Ahasuerus quotes what just happened. He's like, Haman's been hung on the gallows because he tried to do this to the Jews. This is why this was done. And it's interesting because we see the anger of him come out when he's slumped over the couch with Esther on the couch. That's when we see him enraged. But he says here that he's hung from the gallows because he tried to lay hands on the Jews. So, I think that kind of expedited the process of what had happened with Esther, but you really see some humanity there from Ahasuerus. And then verse 8, he kind of tries to right the wrong the same way the wrong was committed. you write a law to counteract this. Put whatever you want in this law, this decree that you're going to send out. Put whatever you want, and you can use the same signet ring that was used to institute the bad law in the first place. So it's really a lot of good development, I think, on Ahasuerus' part. You can make mistakes, sometimes major mistakes, which he did, giving Haman any ounce of power, but he's trying to right the wrong. And I think a lot of times we don't allow people the chance to do that. This is a chance for him to change and to make right a wrong that he, whether indirectly or directly, did have a part in. So I think that's a really fascinating part of the story where if we are cut off after Haman is done away with, we wouldn't know that about Ahasuerus. So that's something I definitely appreciate that being included, this conversation specifically, because it really gives us a lot of information of what's going on and just how impactful this is on Ahasuerus, Esther, Mordecai, and the Jewish people as a whole. We got Eric.
Well, just again, a couple things to think about is one, it appears that some time has passed between the first few verses and verse 3. Although, if we're just kind of blowing through the book, we don't catch that kind of thing. But Esther approaches the king again, and he extends the scepter again. So again, she's risking her life on the part of her people. So that's again just a great testimony to how courageous she is. Bravery is not the absence of fear, but it is enduring and pressing forward in the face of fear. And that's exactly what Esther does. That's just again another testimony to how great of a character she is. I do like the very embellished idea of her presentation to the king. It was embellished previously, but it's just multiple layers here. If it pleases the king, if I have found favor before him, if the matter seems proper to the king, if I am pleasing in his sight. It's just like she is, like Chris said, just throwing herself at his feet. And of course, throughout the book, Esther has found favor. That's the point. That's the providential side of things, is that she always finds favor. And that certainly is a great blessing about, a Christian who's proven their character. Really for a lot of people, they become very almost unimpeachable as far as their character is concerned. If you've got a decent person, and they hear something about somebody who is very contrary to that person's reputation and character, and there really shouldn't be like an immediate acceptance of that. There should be a challenge to that idea and saying, no, that doesn't sound right. That sounds very out of character. And really to a degree going, giving somebody the benefit of the doubt and saying, no, I don't think that happened. I don't think that's right. Let's clear this up. Let's make sure that this is right. So again, just really good testimony to her. Another point that's emphasized here is the lineage of Haman. It's doubly emphasized here that he is he's an Agagite. And we talked about that earlier in the book, the way that he's referenced, kind of like Judas, the one who betrayed Jesus over and over again. When Haman's mentioned, he's always called like an Agagite. And he almost always, you don't always get that, but almost always his lineage is the point of focus. And if this is a reference to King Agag of the Amalekites, this is a callback to the conflict of the Amalekites or the Amalekites, depending on how you want to pronounce that. Everybody's got their preferences, but between these two bodies of people, that really has gone back a long time. I mean, to the reign of Saul. You're talking about a conflict that's 500-600 years old plus, and so the fact that, of course, Mordecai is connected to Kish makes us think that he's connected to the house of Saul, representative of Israel. And then, of course, Haman connected to Agag of the Amalekites. Again, that probably is an emphasis for that. It's the concept of nations, kind of like Jacob and Esau. Jacob I have loved and Esau I have hated. And he's really not just dealing with those individuals, he's dealing with nations. And so it's this idea of national identity, as we see in the Old Testament, that Israel was supposed to be a holy nation and a nation for God's own inheritance, and how sort of to a degree exclusive that was, but how special that was is probably the better word for that. How special that was. And this again is the point that Esther brings. It's, I don't want to, if it was just a trivial inconvenience for the king, I wouldn't bother you with it, but I'm willing to put myself out there. I'm willing to risk my life because the extermination of my people is significant to me, but also sort of implying it's significant to you. And that's why she, sort of implores him in the language of verse 5. This is significant to you. If you measure it as anything but, then don't worry about doing it. But because it is significant, Esther has confidence that he's going to see it as significant. That appeal makes sense. Now, what's ironic about all this is Ahasuerus almost like skirts the issue. What we've seen throughout the book is Ahasuerus wants other people to do the work. He doesn't want to be the one who steps up. And so he's like, I gave you Haman's house, you deal with it. And he's so evasive in what he's doing. I like in chapter 7, she's like, you're the king, you need to do something. She really turned the heat up on him. But even in that volatility of what happens with Haman falling on the couch, the way that he assesses this situation, he says, they have hanged Haman on the gallows. So there's no personal investment in this. It's almost like the visualization we get for him is that he's a buffoon. And he's always getting other people to do his work for him. And probably all of us can think of somebody in our own lives and in our own sphere that probably has that same character, where they're always looking for somebody else to do all the work for them. And if somebody is unwilling to do that, then they'll just badmouth them and, tear them down and say, woe is me. Nobody wants to help out poor me, and just kind of have the pity parade. But the reality is he's just not willing to do anything really for himself. So Mordecai and Esther really have to kind of get the ball rolling. But then finally, we haven't read this far yet, but it seems like the king, finally sort of gets invested in this process, but initially tries to kind of skirt the issue again and say, that's kind of your mess. I'll give you the authority to clean it up, but it's really you that you have to clean it up. And if the king had just been the king from the start and actually asked some questions instead of signing off on a genocide of people he does not even know, if he would have asked some questions from the beginning, he wouldn't be in the mess that he's in. But he still tries to skirt the issue. But eventually, as we get to the back half of chapter 8, we're going to see him start almost kind of getting involved. Andrew?
Well, if Haman were in fact, which it would seem it would fit very well, coming from the lineage of Amalek, that whole nation was supposed to have been wiped out by God's command, and Israel failed to do that. So you really get to see another form or another aspect of irony, that, well, this would have ever happened, or this concern being brought of the Jews now being potentially having to be concerned about potentially being wiped out if they had done what they were supposed to begin with. But that's here nor there, and they have to deal with the problem of, well, we can't deal with that aspect of looking behind us. They probably weren't even considering that if that were the fact. But I can't say for certainty that King Ahasuerus, because as it says, it's sort of written in stone. If people came and in the event, it's written, Jews are going to be executed. That Queen Esther, even though she's queen, she's still a Jew, and she'd be turned over, and sort of like him as being presented as this pushover, would relent, saying, okay, it is written. I really can't put up a fuss. So them really having to press the king to do something or have something done, or ask for permission, obviously, to have something done, was really their only option. And they could not just go throughout the kingdom and try to do something to garner up support. And I mean, it is pretty uh, astonishing to just to try to put all that in perspective, that the whole empire would have this on their calendar, or being made aware of, hey, there's coming a time in the near future that we're supposed to go out and wipe the Jews. And the Jews being in that area, you can imagine, it just came to mind. And is how could someone, if they were Jewish and they lived in other areas of the empire, and you can imagine people looking at them walking past, and you have in your mind that days are coming, and all the people are just waiting. But again, I digress. It said, we're building and building, like what's going to happen. And I couldn't imagine living in a country at that time, sort of knowing, okay, this is the day that I'm potentially going to be attacked. And just all that fear and chaos, it's just building inside. And before we move on to the next section, as it's been mentioned, it's so God and Christ like, as an example. Not that the king is uh, uh, trying to word it in such a way. Even him, in a sense, is a type. He's extending grace and mercy when he extends that scepter. And it's sort of just when we come to God with humility, humble heart, repentant heart, just a great example of how what God does for us today through Christ. I just thought about that too. Let's look at the next section. And Eric, if you don't mind reading verses 9 through 14.
Esther 8, 9 through 14. So the king's scribes were called at that time in the 3rd month, that is the month Sivan, on the 23rd day, and it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded to the Jews, the satraps, the governors, and the princes of the provinces which extended from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces, to every province according to its script, and to every people according to their language, as well as to the Jews according to their script and their language. He wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed it with the king's signet ring, and sent letters by couriers on horses, riding on steeds sired by the royal stud. In them the king granted the Jews who were in each and every city the right to assemble and to defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate the entire army of any people or province which might attack them, including children and women, and to plunder their spoil. On one day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, the 13th day of the 12th month, that is the month Adar, a copy of the edict to be issued as law in each and every province was published to all the peoples, so that the Jews would be ready for this day to avenge themselves on their enemies. The couriers, hastened and impelled by the king's command, went out riding on the royal steeds, and the decree was given out at the citadel in Susa. So I'll just hit a few points here. Obviously, the revoking of this, or the it's not quite an annulment or revoking. It's more like Jews can defend themselves, and anybody who wants to defend the Jews can defend them too. So because he can't revoke what's already in place as far as the law. That's a point in Daniel. That's a point in, you know, really all these kind of captivity and post-captivity books. So they're going to defend them, and a lot of this is a callback to chapter 1. A lot of this is a callback to earlier things in the book as far as trying to undo things. All 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. Again, Persia was massive. The Persian Empire was just huge, and so it's written to everybody, and there is an emphasis about the Jews according to their script and their language now. So we have that sort of cultural identification and deliverance as God's chosen nation. Now, what's interesting is when you put something in Jewish writing, it probably means that they're referencing Hebrew. What's funny is in the 70 years of captivity, the Jews really, by and large, did not understand Hebrew. That's something that comes up in Nehemiah 8 at the Watergate revival, is that the priests actually have to translate things from the Hebrew. They're more familiar with Aramaic at this time. So maybe it was translated in Aramaic as well. But if you're talking about the Hebrew language, of course, that would be something that a lot of the people probably would need a little help with anyway. So maybe it's a reference to Aramaic for their benefit. But again, really, it's Mordecai that's doing all the action here. He does it in King Ahasuerus' authority. It says that, you know, in this decree, the king granted this authority, but it's Mordecai who wrote it up. Mordecai who sent it out. Again, the king is fairly passive in this process. Now, there is a double emphasis on the horses that are sent out are sired by the royal stud, which basically we would say these are race horses. These are like the best of the best horses. That's one of those things that you'll see. Of course, we're all in Kentucky, so we're used to that idea of horses being of a certain stock and a certain breed and of a certain pedigree. And you know, you want somebody who's you want to be part of that royal stud. A lot of people pay big money to mate their mares with these studs, these racehorse studs. So we're kind of familiar with that here in Kentucky. One thing that is important about this is that the Persians were famous, and they are famous even today because of this, at this time, for their like express mail system, essentially. That if the king sent something out, they would have these hitching stations, and these horses would go nonstop to these hitching stations, and then another horse would go nonstop. So they could communicate to the farthest parts of their empire within a period of about 2 weeks. You know, so this is really significant. And the fact that it's doubly emphasized here in Esther 8, it's a great historical validation of what's going on here and kind of how significant that is. It's published to all people. Everybody needs to know about it. Anybody who stands against the Jews is basically forfeit. Like if the Jews need to avenge themselves on anybody, they have the liberty to do that. But one thing that's helpful here is the time limitation of the decree is a safeguard against sort of an ongoing vendetta of vengeance. This is not something that is like an open-ended decree of if anybody is mean to the Jews at any point in the future, you know, the Jews can just attack you and kill you. That's not what this is. So for once, there's a little bit of wisdom in one of these royal decrees. It's probably because Mordecai is the one writing it as opposed to Haman or somebody else. But there's a lot of wisdom in this. It's not about vengeance. It's about justice. And what ends up happening because of Haman's line and because of his connections to Agag and the Amalekites is that effectively Mordecai is doing with the Amalekites what Saul failed to do initially hundreds of years prior. So this is really a neat sort of like tie up of something that's been lingering out there biblically for hundreds of years, for centuries. Chris?
I think, you know, it's interesting, like you pointed out, Eric, you've got it written to the Jews in their own language. You have it written to everybody, that everyone can understand this decree. Everyone can understand this and apply it because it's that important. And you think of really kind of that being a shadow with the scriptures, everything now translated into every language that every person can understand the importance of it. This wasn't a decree that was just meant for one or two people to read, but for everybody to read because it was that important. And like you had talked about with the transportation of it, in this instance, we have to make sure that everybody in the kingdom knows about this decree. Why? Because innocent people are going to lose their lives if this decree is not issued. And I like what you said. It wasn't necessarily an open invitation for the Jews to just enact vengeance on anybody for any given reason. But in a sense, with Haman's decree, the Jews were left without any type of defense other than God, obviously, which is the most important defense. And we see the providence working out of God defending his people. But the irony of it to me, and like you'd said, Eric, he has Mordecai write this. And obviously, I think God was guiding Mordecai as he wrote this. But in Haman's decree, he had convinced Ahasuerus that the Jewish people were a threat to the Persian Empire. And now, through Mordecai, Ahasuerus is saying, with Mordecai's pen and him writing it, that the Jewish people are allowed to defend themselves against Ahasuerus' own people. So that's a development in this that's just really, you think, no king, no dignitary makes laws, you would think, to put into place to protect other people that could be enacted on their own people. It's just a weird way of this being played out. But you stop and you think of Ahasuerus and you think of how he is. First, he gave the signet ring to Haman, and it ended up getting into a mess with it. And he's having to, like Eric said, passively pass off the mess, somebody else take care of it. I mean, really, you could almost say he makes the same mistake, let's say, by giving Mordecai the ring. Because what if Mordecai, now he's been, avenged by Haman? Maybe he gets thirsty for blood and the Jews can do whatever they want. So in a sense, Ahasuerus doesn't necessarily learn. He does the same thing again, like you had pointed out, which I think is interesting. But before I pass it on to Andrew, with Mordecai here, we're in awe of Esther, and we should be, but you have to be in awe of him too, because he was outside the king's gate. He was weeping. He was mourning the impending doom of his people. And all of a sudden now he's got the ring. That's a big turn. And we know from the scriptures and we know just from life, power can corrupt people very quickly. But the reason this is written is not for the Jews to come out on top. It's for them to defend themselves and to be protected. And with Mordecai, he could use biases against the Persian people because of Haman, or the Aggites, could just be, I hate them because of Haman. But in the decree, it's to protect the Jewish people from any unnecessary attacks. And I think that that's a really good lesson from Esther and a really good lesson from Mordecai that we get from this story, is that just because you're in a position of power, you don't have to let that go to your head. And Mordecai is a servant, and you see that in the decree. You see that in him warning Ahasuerus of the impending assassination attempt that may have been made if he wouldn't have warned him. You see servitude there. You see that in Esther, and it radiates. And you think of how lucky the Jewish people were because they had those two pleading their case. But I think the reason that makes them so effective is they're being guided by someone much greater than them. And that's so impressive in that decree. Because, if you think of us, like if you were the president for a day, what would you do? Would you do what's best for everybody, or would you do what made you feel right? And Mordecai, in that sense, has free reign. Write the decree. I don't want to write it. You write it. And he does the right thing. And that's so powerful. And you think of, like we talked about with Joseph. Joseph's in a similar situation in the book of Genesis where he's given the power and authority, and he simply just tries to do the right thing to please God and to help other people. And that's so powerful. And once, like I said, it's like a movie, you know, Mordecai, this build up. Here he is. He's got the ring. What's he going to do? He does what he needs to do. Extremely powerful. What you got, Andrew?
I just again wonder what potentially the people, the Persians throughout the land thought of their king, especially when they get in this new edict and thinking, okay, you first of all told us to wipe out the Jews on this particular day. Now you're telling that they can potentially, if we attack them, wipe us out. And what kind of king are you? And uh, the Jews could potentially rule us or overtake us if we attempted to rid. It would definitely be a head scratcher trying to figure out how to make of it. Part of it was saying, man, this is not worth getting involved in. I want to move. I don't want to live no more in this kingdom because king just doesn't know what he's doing. I mean, that's what, of course, we don't live in that time frame, but just kind of from the outside looking in, it's like, okay, like double speak, double talk. But thankfully, as uh, it's illustrated here, this is uh, an instrument of probably an aspect of an eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, righteous justice, not looking for the vendetta of, hey, you attacked me first, and I'm going to show you what it's like really to experience pain. Because now I'm the one who's in authority and I have the right to do whatever I want. And thankfully, Mordecai, very humble and very prudent, completely opposite of the king as far as what it seems intelligence wise. And there's probably some definitely heavenly guidance in this aspect as well of just how it is really the exact opposite of what was stated before. And great example of seeing how God is just and he looks after uh, his people and will take care of his people. All right, let me finish up this last three verses. Beginning of verse 15, then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white, with a large crown of gold and a garment of fine linen and purple. City of Susa, shouting and rejoice. For the Jews, there was light, gladness, and joy, and honor in each and every province and in each and every city. Wherever the king's commandment and his decree arrived, there was gladness and joy for the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many among the peoples of the land became Jews, for the dread of the Jews had fallen on them. Again, we go back where when it was initially put the decree in verse chapter 3, the city was in mass confusion. And now there is the exact opposite, great joy. Get this image of Mordecai. He more or less looks like a king figure more so than Ahasuerus. It's like, let me follow that guy. That guy seems like he has it all together and understands how to do things right. But obviously, the Jews very much seeing that hope is restored and God can do amazing things beyond our imagination. I was just thinking about it as we were reading the previous passage of just how when Assyria was at Jerusalem's doorstep, and that one night, God wiped out 185,000 when Hezekiah was throwing up his hands and also asking, I mean, I think Isaiah was there too, and it's like, okay, Hezekiah's like, what we're gonna do? And pretty hopeless situation there. And now they were in a hopeless situation. Now it's a complete opposite. They do have hope, and it alludes to that celebration that Jews still celebrate to this day, Purim, and they remember what occurred with Esther and in that account and how they were delivered from potential extermination. Chris.
Talk about character development. We're introduced to Mordecai in chapter 2. He's a certain Jew named Mordecai, goes through his lineage. He's a Benjamite. He raises Esther as his own daughter. And then you see the progression of this take place, of him just being kind of in the shadows. Well, then he takes a more prominent role when he learns about the assassination attempt, and he's always outside the gates. He's always, it seems to be, outside. Then now all of a sudden these events transpire with, Ahasuerus, like Eric had pointed out, him reading the record of what Mordecai had done. And Mordecai just begins to, you just see this rise up. All while Haman this whole time has been trying to get higher up. And like we've talked about, who really didn't care about Ahasuerus at all. He was just trying to gain more and more power. If Ahasuerus finally got in the way, he would have tried to remove him too. You see that rise of power, of wanting to be exalted, of wanting to be the best of the best. Guess where that gets him? Hanging from a gallows. Mordecai, on the other hand, goes from being, taking Esther as his own, raising her as his own daughter. That wasn't getting any type of press or headlines. People around the kingdom weren't going around saying, isn't Mordecai a great guy because he's raising a relative as his own daughter? No one was saying that. No one was saying that when he was weeping in the court about his people being exterminated. That wasn't happening with him. There has to be something. God's not mentioned one time in this book, but there has to be someone orchestrating this. And when you read that text, Andrew, it made me think of our principal verse we've read, where he talks about in verse 14, if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise from the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? The whole time I've read that verse, my whole life, I've thought of Esther, but in a sense, it's also talking about Mordecai too, because Mordecai steps up when the time was there. He spoke up about the assassination attempt. He was doing the right thing and not getting any type of press, any type of, good tidings. He didn't warn about the assassination attempt because he wanted Ahasuerus to give him something. He was doing it because it was the right thing. And all throughout, it's like Haman's going to win. Haman's going to win. Haman's going to win. God said that's not going to happen. And Mordecai, just like Joseph, and ultimately like Jesus, not exalting self, Christ warns about that time and time again. If you exalt yourself, you'll get your reward, but it's not going to be the reward that you ultimately are going to want. And you think of Mordecai being led around by Haman around the city that burnt Haman up, but that's not really what Mordecai cared about. That's not what he really wanted. Ahasuerus clothing him with this robe. That's not really what he really cared about. I think once that decree was written, I bet there was probably a sense of relief on him that what I really want to happen has happened, and my people will hopefully be safe because of this decree. And you think of verse 16, like Andrew read, the Jews had light and gladness, joy and honor. We talked about like the doomsday clock ticking. Every second you're closer to your extermination. But because good people stood up and good people listened to God's voice, guide them, guess what happens? Everything changes. Ultimately, God is the reason for their joy and gladness because he put Esther and Mordecai in this situation. But I think it's also a good call for us to think about of we are sinners. We fall short all the time. We make mistakes. Esther wasn't perfect. Mordecai wasn't perfect either. But God puts us in positions to do the right thing. And ultimately, that needs to be turned around to glorify God. These Jewish people, everything changes. All because God put these people in the places that they needed to be in. These individuals listened to God's voice, and that really shows. You'd say, well, Mordecai's just one guy, and Esther, she's just one woman. But because of their actions, it says the Jews did. The Jews felt that way. And then verse 17, many people of the land became Jews. Gentiles going over to Judaism. That's a little bit of foreshadowing. You think we talked about types and shadows. Christ talks about this in the New Testament. The Old Testament, we talked about this in Romans, mentions it a number of times of Gentiles and Jews coming together to be able to worship God, to be able to be a part of God's family. And it's amazing to read this and see that play out too. You cannot deny God. Andrew guided us through a study of Rahab not too long ago. Rahab could not deny God and God's power and God's deliverance for his people. And the people in Persia are seeing that play out too. They're seeing that happen. So really the big takeaway for me is when God puts you in positions, do what's right and ultimately point that glory towards God. That's why I love this story so much, because you wouldn't think Mordecai was going to do anything at the beginning of the story. You really think Esther maybe would play that big of a part when you think of how reckless Ahasuerus has been. But when you do what you need to do, you follow the commandments of God, you put others above yourself, a lot of good things can happen. And that's why I'm glad we went through Ruth and this. These are underappreciated stories. Do you think of the applications we can take? It's extremely powerful. We got Eric.
Just a couple minor things just to supplement what you guys have said. In chapter 3 and verses 14 and 15, when the decree went out from Haman for the Jews, there was mourning, fasting, weeping, and lamenting. And all that has turned now into light, gladness, joy, and honor. So I like that fourfold reversal and terminology. That's pretty neat. Mordecai is second only to the king at this point, which is a point of emphasis that's going to come up in chapter 9 and in chapter 10. In fact, that's how chapter 10 ends. For Mordecai the Jew was second only to King Ahasuerus, great among the Jews and in favor with his many kinsmen, one who sought the good of his people, one who spoke for the welfare of his whole nation. If we could have a ruler like that, if we could have a president like that, if we could have Congress people like that, representatives like that, then our country would be in a much better position, rather than the coercion and the greed and the corruption that we see. It would be nice to have somebody like Mordecai instead, or people like Mordecai instead. I do like that the people proselytize. That's something that has happened before in the Old Testament. It says when they were going into the Exodus that some of the Egyptians wanted to come with them. So you have proselytes there, and they were welcome to come with them. We know that Rahab proselytized, I think, as was mentioned. So there were proselytes in the Old Testament. And even when you get into Jesus' ministry in the New Testament, he talks about the Pharisees and Sadducees, the scribes, and various groups of people traveling land and sea to make a proselyte. Now, unfortunately, they had other aims and other sort of ulterior motives in doing some of that. But people, the whole point of Israel was not to sort of be exclusivistic, although they were supposed to be unique. They were supposed to be different. It was to be so beautiful and to be so attractive that the Gentiles would want inclusion. And that's exactly what happens. In fact, in the New Testament, as we read about, like in Romans, again, with this grafting in of the Gentiles and the Jewish branches that were tapped into the root, sort of became jealous and envious of this. And he says that that was the point all along. The point all along was to graft the Gentiles in, to establish a strong plant that the Gentiles could be grafted into, that would bring about salvation for all who would believe in Jesus, and repent and confess him as Lord, and be immersed in water for the forgiveness of their sins. That was the point, to bring it all to that fruition of the new covenant era, and that new covenant being enacted by the blood of Jesus. And in fact, that's really what you see even in like John's gospel in particular. It's my time has not yet come, my time has not yet come, my hour has not yet come, my hour has not yet come. And then it is when the Greeks seek Jesus that Jesus says, the time has come. That's where you see, like in John 12, you see that real big transition. It's when the Greeks seek Jesus out. It's when the Gentiles are the ones who are just voraciously seeking the kingdom of God, that Jesus says, now is the time where I'm going to die. And that was, the fullness of the times, as we see kind of an expression in the New Testament. One other point, just in verse 17, there was gladness and joy for the Jews, a feast and a holiday. That holiday term is Tob Yom in Hebrew. Tob is a generic word for good. So the New King James Version, other translations will just say a good day. New American Standard Version goes typically with the idea of a holiday. That holiday is kind of forecasting the events of chapter 9 and chapter 10, particularly chapter 9, where Esther is going to lay out customs in the law that will sort of give an idea of what Purim is supposed to look like. Now, unfortunately, Purim has become kind of like Haman's feast nowadays through the centuries, and it's mainly kind of a drunken party, unlike what it originally was supposed to be. But just goes to show what humanity often does with good days. They turn good days into terrible days. So I just wanted to make one comment about that kind of little translational detail.
Well, we thank you for tuning in and joining us in this discussion. We hope that what we talked about benefited you, and hopefully encourage you to dig deeper into books like Esther, and more importantly, knowing who God is, how to have a relationship, realizing that he does save his people very often in ways that we can't even begin to imagine. He still continues to save people today. Maybe not in the way that it happened during the time of Esther, but he does offer salvation, and he does want people, all people, to come to him. And we would love to speak to you further about what that looks like, what God has written and revealed in his word on how we are to come to him, how we are to live in order, so when this time on this side of eternity is over, that when it's our turn to stand before the Lord, that he will welcome us with open arms. That is what he desires. And that's what should be our desire, to be with him for all eternity. So Lord willing, we'll be back with another episode of Three Guys in the Word next week. But you don't have to wait till next week to reach out to us if you have questions or want to study further. You can find us at the Taylorsville Road Church of Christ Facebook page or at TaylorvilleRDChurchofChrist.com. Love to hear from you, but hopefully you will tune in when we do come together and speak further as we get closer to the end of our discussion in the Book of Esther. But thank you so much for being with us and having the desire to learn more about who God is. So we'll cut it off there, and we hope to see you next time. But until then, may God bless you and take care.